In developing language tests, teachers usually ask themselves questions such as, what type of test should we use? How can we best interpret the results of our tests? How can we be sure that the test scores are valid for this use? Bachmann claims these questions can only be addressed in relation to the specific situation for which the test was developed, since they are based on a range of prior considerations that vary from context to context. This presentation explores the process of test design in reference to relevant literature, with the aim of discussing several issues that are central to the fields of testing and evaluation. The objectives are to discuss the process of language test design, to analyze the decisions made in the process of test design, to help you reflect on the difficulties evaluators face when trying to find a balance between what the literature claims and the way in which reality conditions their work. Some sections of the test of reading comprehension will be analyzed in reference to some of the categories of the test method facets presented in Bachmann, together with the context in which the test was implemented. As the title shows, during the years 2016 and 17, we devoted our research project to the assessment of reading comprehension. We had been working on the area of reading for several years and on varied issues and from different perspectives, those of the learner and those of the teachers, on reading comprehension in L1 and in the foreign language. The idea of exploring criterion referenced evaluation came as the need to get to know how census tests are designed and implemented. You have surely heard about PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. You have been part of the ONE, Operativo Nacional de Evaluación, from the Dirección Nacional de Información y Evaluación de Calidad Educativa. And there are other validated tests specific of reading comprehension, such as the PEARLS, the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, or the TERCE, Third Regional Comparative and Exploratory Study of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization. The name of the research project was Desarrollo y validación de instrumentos para la evaluación criterial de la comprensión lectora en el nivel secundario. Área curricular, lengua extranjera, inglés. It was thought and implemented as a census of the reading abilities of the students in 6th year of secondary schools of the municipal educational system after 9 years of English as a foreign language instruction. We followed a criterion reference model of evaluation, and we developed the instruments for this purpose. These instruments were piloted, which is a necessary step in the validation of a test instrument, and the test format followed the one implemented by the Operativo Nacional de Evaluación para el fin de la escuela secundaria, which was implemented in 2013. The contents of the tests were based on the NAPs, Núcleos de Aprendizaje Prioritarios del Consejo Federal de Educación, and diseños curriculares de la Provincia de Buenos Aires de lengua extranjera inglés. We decided to adopt a criterion-referenced approach to the testing of reading comprehension, since our purpose was to obtain information about the individual's mastery of a certain domain, reading in this case. We wanted to know what each student was able to do in relation to reading. Our aim was not to rank candidates according to their levels of performance, which is the aim of norm reference testing. It wasn't either to determine how much the students had progressed from a certain moment onwards, which is the focus of progress assessment. Once we had clear in mind what we wanted to do, we had to start the process of design of the instruments. In order to do this, we followed the framework of test method facets presented by Bachmann. The author claims that these facets affect performance on language tests and that any factors that may affect test scores are potential sources of error that should be minimized to increase both the reliability of the scores and the validity of the interpretations. Bachmann argues that the development of a test, a language test, needs to be based on the following logical sequence. First, identifying and defining the construct theoretically. Second, defining the construct operationally. Third, establishing procedures for quantifying the observations. The term construct refers to an abstract concept, a mental ability, such as language proficiency, that cannot be observed, but that is inferred on the basis of observable behavior. In order to measure such a mental ability, it is necessary to define its attributes unambiguously in order to be able to define it operationally and make it observable. These two first steps provide the basis for evaluating the validity of the uses of the test scores. The third, how observations are quantified, directly relates to test reliability. It is important that the scales used are precise and that they are applied consistently. So, according to the purpose of the project and the approach adopted, we needed to define 3 items for criterion referenced evaluation of reading. These 3 items were the competence being tested, that is, what we were going to test, the indicators which make the competence observable, and finally, the levels of performance, that is, the degree of skill or ability within which this competence was achieved. As you see, this definition is the construct of reading. It is the one adopted by the National Evaluation Program, that is the ONE. It is very complex and deserves the analysis of its members, of its parts. By reading it carefully, understanding each element and memorizing it as a definition, you, as a teacher, will be able to have a precious tool to design and analyze reading comprehension activities for teaching or testing, depending on how you implement these tasks. So, as the definition states, reading comprehension is a cognitive capacity of reconstructing the meaning of a written text through the process of reading. In this first line, we may refer to Goodman and Rosenblatt, in that it acknowledges the presence of the writer and the reader mediated through the text. The definition goes on to say that this process is recursive, highlighting the idea that reading is not a linear process. Studies in reading show that this is so even from the physical part, when the eyes are confronted with the text. The eyes go forwards and backwards all the time as they pay attention to new incoming information in milliseconds. From the brain processes, it is also acknowledged that we know, and we know this from our own experience as readers, that as we go on with the text, we sometimes need to go back to revise what was said before to check if we had understood what was stated or to enjoy the text more deeply. Next, the definition of the construct states the following, and involves tasks such as extraction and integration of information, as well as reflection and evaluation of local and global statements of the text. This statement mentions the reading process involved in comprehension. So, these are the processes a skilled reader does when confronted with a text. They are extracting information from a text, integrating information from different sections of the text, and reflecting on it, as well as evaluating it personally with or against background knowledge. that is, evaluating it with the theory of the world in our heads that Smith refers to. For the design of the test, we had to take into account three dimensions: the texts, the context of use, and the reading processes. As regards texts, that is, different discourse types, we included two authentic texts. One was a narrative text, a fable, and the other one was an informative text, a museum brochure. And we also included a third text that was an argumentative essay downloaded with permission from the BBC. The second dimension to consider was the contexts, that is, the context of use of these texts. In the case of the fable, for example, we can say that it belongs to the personal domain, though this could be discussed. The museum brochure is an example of a public context text, and the argumentative essay fits within the category of an educational context. The three texts were part of the discourse repertoire students should have been acquainted with by the end of their formal schooling, according to the Diseños Curriculares and the Núcleos de Aprendizaje Prioritarios. The third dimension was the reading processes. The position we take as regards reading comprehension is the one that considers it as an interactive and transactive process between reader and text, rather than a decoding and passive process. Here, again, you may go back to the conceptual framework explained by Goodman and Rosenblatt. We also agree with Sanz Moreno in the value of reading comprehension in multiple situations and contexts, of reading as a moment of personal reflection. We value the social dimension of reading and the multiple objectives of reading comprehension, such as aesthetic, cognitive, or for entertainment. The model of reading we adopted takes into account a great number of processes and explains the complexity of the interactions between the cognitive processes and the information provided by the text. These three texts are the ones that were included in the final instruments after piloting several others. So we decided on the authentic text brochure visiting the Fashion Museum, the authentic text fable, The Dog and His Shadow, and the third one, a semi-authentic text for educational purposes and argumentative essays about elephants. As we have said before, reading is an intricate, sophisticated, and complex mental activity, difficult to observe, where many processes take place at the same time. For the purpose of making them observable by means of indicators, the first thing we had to do was to identify the different processes in the clearest way possible. So, following the validated national and international reading comprehension tests, we decided to work with three processes: access and retrieve, interpret and integrate, and reflect and evaluate. Access and retrieve. This process implies a relative quick or automatic comprehension of information. The reader locates where the information is presented and retrieves it and extracts it to solve a task. In a task situation, this involves revising, looking for, selecting, comparing the information in a question with what is provided by the text, literally or paraphrasing, depending on the level. Interpreting and integrating is the second set of processes, which means filling in vacuums of meaning. To integrate implies recognizing and understanding the text coherence, relating information from several parts of the text to give sense to it. To complete such tasks, the reader has to determine what the appropriate connection is. Interpreting means extracting meaning from what is not stated, that is, making inferences. This implies reconstructing the global and local meaning of portions or the whole text, comparing, contrasting, integrating. By the way, here you can make a point and identify the differences between inferencing and predicting, two reading processes that are sometimes confused. The third one is reflect and evaluate, meaning drawing upon knowledge, ideas, or attitudes beyond the text in order to relate the information provided within the piece of discourse to one's own conceptual and experiential frames of reference, that is, with the theory of the world in our heads, or with what we call background knowledge. During the reading process, and even after it, the reader consults his own experience to compare, make hypotheses or judgments on the content or on the format of the text. The three processes defined so far are not conceived of as entirely separate and independent, but rather as interrelated and interdependent. Indeed, from a cognitive processing perspective, they can be considered to be semi-hierarchical. It's not possible to interpret or integrate information without having first accessed it. And it is not possible to reflect or evaluate information without having retrieved the information and make some sort of interpretation before. So, as I have said, we had to define the indicators for each reading process. These indicators make the reading processes observable and give access to information about what the students can do in reference to reading. Indicators are defining characteristics of the ability or competence under scrutiny. They divide the competence into its constituent parts for the purpose of analysis. Here you can have a look at some examples of the indicators identified for measuring reading comprehension in each of the three processes. So, to explain it very simply, how can I know whether the student is able to access and retrieve information from a text? Some answers could be if he can find information that is salient in it, or if he finds information embedded in the text, or if he finds information in the text and relates it to a visual representation. How can I know whether the student is able to interpret and integrate information? I can see this if he can recognize the main idea from a text, for example, or if he is able to deduce the meaning of a word by context. And how is it about reflecting and evaluating? How can I know if the student can do this? If the student can identify, for example, the purpose of a text, or if he can derive the morale, or if he can propose something related to the content of the text. So, once the indicators have been defined, there came the turn for the design of the tasks that call for these processes. The following three slides present some examples of the tasks designed to register the processes described before. The questions included were of different types. There were multiple choice questions with 4 options, with only one that was the correct statement. The 4 options were designed in such a way that we considered a similar length. The wording was carefully chosen so as to avoid overt differences. The wrong options were expressed in such a way that they could also have been possible. There were questions in which students had to underline some words or even portions of the text. There were also open questions designed so that the students had to produce the answer. In these cases, they could do so in Spanish. Throughout the text, the first questions were relatively easy to answer, so as to help the students feel at ease with the test and to avoid frustration and threat from the very beginning. The high-order questions, that is, those that assess their capacity of making inferences or evaluating the texts, were embedded all along the instrument. We also took into account the order in which the information appeared in the texts when sequencing the questions. Here are two examples of tasks that call for reflection and evaluation, as in the case of identifying the purpose of a text or giving reasons where the information is not included in the text, but in the reader's own experience. This slide shows the different levels of performance that the students achieved. Level 1 was the more basic one. So, going back to the first question, the one that guided the choice of the evaluation model to follow in this research, which was, what can the students in 6th-year secondary school do in reference to reading? We could answer it accounting with their abilities and the level of performance. That is, some students were able to locate explicitly stated information in a prominent position when there is no competing information. That is, this group of students achieved level 1. Others could do this and also retrieve several pieces of information embedded in the text. So these students could be assigned to level 2. And another group of students could also add the capacity to locate and organize several pieces of deeply embedded information, thus going to level 3. The 3 levels of performance then could show that some students were ready to comprehend a short text on a familiar topic, those of level 1. Others could also make connections between the text and outside knowledge or personal experience, that is level 2. And another group, those in group 3, level 3, could demonstrate understanding of this short text with an unfamiliar context or form to the previous activities. So, the purpose of this presentation was to introduce you to the design of a criterion-referenced evaluation. The idea was for you to see the complexity of decisions that teachers and researchers have to face when designing an exam for a specific group of students. It's important, as we said before, to work on the construct, that is deciding what is it that we want to test, and then make this construct operational, that is being able to see how this is demonstrated or fulfilled by the students. Although this is based on reading comprehension, the same pattern, the same model could be applied to all the components of language ability.